The okay button mean anything?
Ready, Mary Ellen? Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm John Berkowitz from Northampton in Western Massachusetts, and I'm a member of the statewide organization Massachusetts Peace Action and its Ukraine Peace Campaign. Our program tonight is titled Ukraine War, End It Now or Lose Much More Later. And our guest speaker is retired U.S. Marine Corps Captain Matthew Hoh. He is a disabled veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who resigned in 2009 from a State Department job in Afghanistan due to his opposition to President Obama's decision to escalate the war at that time in Afghanistan. He is now an analyst and commentator on military and foreign policy issues with the Eisenhower Media Network. He also ran as a Green Party candidate for a congressional seat in North Carolina in 2022. Mr. Hoh, did I get that right? A congressional seat or another public office?
Oh, it was a U.S. Senate seat. Thanks, John.
I missed it. It wasn't just the House. You were going for the Senate.
Right, right.
Why
Well, the whole story behind it.
not? Why not? Um, Before I turn it over to him, he'll speak for about 30 minutes. And then, after a few brief announcements of upcoming programs and events, we will have a question and answer dialogue with Mr. Hoh until 8:30 p.m. In order to hear from as many of you as possible, we'll ask you to be brief and keep your question or comments to not more than 40 seconds. And with such a crowd, I don't think we can even do that, by voice or by hand icon. We'll use the chat, and Mary Ellen, the tech administrator of this program, will read the chat questions. But once again, don't write a lot. Keep it really brief and succinct, under 40 seconds for her to read out loud, and then Mr. Hoh can respond. So with that, thank you everybody for showing up tonight, and I'm going to turn this over to Matthew Hoh. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone, everyone joining this evening. And I especially appreciate, Massachusetts Peace Action for putting together not just this webinar, but all the webinars that they do, all the work that they do. I know they have announcements coming up about future actions, and hopefully people can support as they can. This time that we're in right now, the comments that John opened with, not just what we see overseas, but what we're seeing happening in this country. I'd second John's comments about Democracy Now! Playing those excerpts from Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech, as well as Been to the Mountaintop speech. If you've not listened to them in a while, do yourself a favor and listen to them. Struck by the resonance that they carry today, particularly Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech, which this time listening to it, I was really struck by how much the speech was not about Vietnam. I mean, so much of that for me is wrapped around his denunciation of the war. But the speech itself, listening to it yesterday, how much of it concerned things beyond Vietnam, as the title states, it really, again, resonated with all that's going on right now. And I would actually like to quote one thing from his speech, as well as another quote that was provided this morning by a New Englander as well. But, in Beyond Vietnam, Dr. King says, "These are the times for real choices and not false ones. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we all must protest." And then in the last couple of days, a bishop in New Hampshire, Robert Hirschfield, has made statements similar to Dr. King's declaration. And Bishop Hirschfield said, "Now is no longer the time for statements, but for us with our bodies to stand between the powers of this world and the most vulnerable." So I'll leave that at that and get into my presentation. Again, I want to thank Mass Peace Action, John, Paul, Mary Ellen. Thank you for putting this together. When I looked at my description of what I had told John I was going to say, I was, holy cow, I really said I cover a lot. So I'm going to cut back on some of what I intended to cover. Try and keep this in a half-hour time frame, and then we'll have plenty of time for a conversation discussion afterwards. One of the things I did note when I looked at the description of what I was going to say was that, it said Matt Hoh is going to tell you all about the political and military and economic status of this war. And I said, geez, I left out the human status. What's the human situation? What's the human state of this war? And so I just want to go over that with you, and then I'll get into my analysis of where the belligerents are at and why negotiations, an end to this war, is what's needed, and what it potentially could look like a year from now if negotiations are not successful. So with regards to the human state of this war, and of course, this is the most important state, I think this is why we are all here together on a Massachusetts Peace Action webinar. The reality that this is not academic, this is not theatrical, that this is very real, that there are human lives, that there is great suffering, that there is great ruination, that people have been torn apart, families destroyed by this war. This is much bigger than geopolitical analysis or commentary. This is the reality for hundreds of thousands, for millions, tens of millions of people. So with regard to the human state, I'll just note that the United Nations came out with a report in the past week stating that this was the most violent year for civilians in this war since 2022. In 2025, there were more than 2,500 civilians killed, more than 12,000 wounded. That was a 31% increase over 2024's numbers. All told, since the invasion nearly 4 years ago of Ukraine by Russia, there has been 15,000 Ukrainian civilians killed and 40,000 wounded. And like so many wars, that's believed to be an undercount. With regards to Ukrainian attacks on Russians, because we've certainly see a high volume of Ukrainian attacks, missile attacks, drone attacks, artillery attacks, rocket attacks, incursions, etc., into Russia, it's certainly not near the same level, but you have had more than 600 Russians killed in this war that has predominantly taken place in Ukraine, and thousands of wounded, throughout Western Russia. In terms of the human cost, it goes farther into the displacement. So we're looking at 4 million internally displaced Ukrainians and roughly 6 million who are refugees outside of Ukraine. And that's a staggering number when you understand that Ukraine, pre-invasion Ukraine, was about 41 million, including the Russian occupied or Russian controlled areas of the Donbass. When you start taking away the refugees, when you start taking away the parts of Ukraine that Russia controls, you're looking quite possibly at a Ukraine that has less than 28 million people. So a 13 million person decline in 4 years of a country of 41 million. I mean, that's quite staggering. The military casualties are unknown. Estimates range from the hundreds of thousands into the millions. If anyone believes any of the governmental sources on this, I'm just going to say I don't, no matter who it is. My own analysis, my own observation, I believe it's likely in the hundreds of thousands, the lower end of the hundreds of thousands of casualties, 250 to 350 or 400,000 wounded and killed on both sides. But certainly that's, coming from a guy trying to watch this from North Carolina, and the casualties may be just as high as speculated by many. So, when you start talking about that, though, running into casualties, even if it's in that lower end of hundreds of thousands, I mean, you just think about the loss, again, the ruination. And for each one of those numbers, the weight, the burden, the immiseration that is put upon the families, both Ukrainian and Russian. And so the effects of this war in 4 years, transcend through hundreds of thousands or maybe even possibly, 1 or 2 million families, as well as then the displaced. You're looking at a war that, while it may not match up in terms of the volume, the human volume, as we've seen in other wars, it certainly can be said to be the largest or most destructive conventional war in the Western Hemisphere. I'm sorry, in the West since World War II. The other aspect of this that we can get into in the Q&A, if you'd like to, is all the other effects of this war on Ukraine, the environmental destruction, the industrial and infrastructure destruction, the residential housing, buildings. I mean, just the sheer scale of the destruction of this war, I don't think is truly understood outside of the war zone. We see video, you see some descriptions, but the sheer destruction that this war has brought is something that will require decades to reconstitute from, to rebuild, to reconstruct. And just one thing I should talk about, though, is the legacy of war that will go on for decades. And I'm not talking about the rebuilding or the reconstruction or the grief from this war. I'm talking about the very real effects of unexploded ordnance. The estimates are that more than 20% of Ukraine is littered with millions and millions and millions of tons of unexploded ordnance, whether that be landmines, whether that be shells, whether it be drones, etc. It will take decades to clear. And so the casualties from this war will continue, just as they've had in other places, such as Algeria or Southeast Asia, for decades, trying to clear the unexploded ordnance, that legacy, or the remnants of war that will kill for decades to come. The other aspect of this is the toxic legacy, the toxic remnants of war. Modern warfare is incredibly poisonous. What it does to the air, to the land, to the water is insidious. We are talking about whether it's destroyed vehicles, whether it's the chemicals that are used in war, whether it's the munitions, whether it's specific munitions like depleted uranium, which both sides have used in this war. You're talking about a poisoning of the air, land, and sea that will be resident within generations of people. So just as we have in Iraq, just like we have in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, where we have decades after the warfare, mothers still giving birth to deformed, disabled, stillborn children because of the toxic legacy of the war, most especially, say, Southeast Asia with Agent Orange, or the poisoning of Iraq from the American invasion and occupation. It's very likely that generations from now, both Ukrainian and Russian mothers will be delivering children who are disabled, deformed, dead because of the toxic legacy of this war. And that's just one aspect of the human state of this war, the human reality of this war, that I don't think's addressed enough. But I want to get into the analysis of the war here as I see it, where I see, where I see the situation right now, how I think the belligerents in this conflict see it themselves, the issues that they're up against, and why I think it's imperative for both sides, or all sides, you could say, to negotiate an end to this conflict. I'll start with the Russians first, and I'll probably spend the most time on the Russians because I feel that, of course, here in the West is the side in this conflict that is least understood. I mean, certainly up until I think the Israeli genocide in Gaza, I think you can make an argument that the Ukraine-Russia war was the most propagandized war of all time. And certainly the information that we have, both sides of the conflict, or all sides of the conflict, is incredibly difficult to truly understand in terms of the veracity of it or the credibility of it. But my analysis of the Russians, their core demands since at least the fall of 2022 have not changed. You don't see any reason for them changing those demands. Whether it's the control of the occupied territory, whether it's their demand for Ukrainian neutrality, demilitarization of Ukraine, or as the Russians call it, denazification of Ukraine as well, which would be a political shift in Ukraine from put simply, a pro-West perspective to a pro-Russian perspective. But even then, it goes farther into aspects of the right wing in Ukraine. The Russians militarily feel strong. As all the Russians have been advancing slowly westward in Ukraine since essentially end of summer of 2023. They have the upper hand on the battlefield, and as well, they've weathered more than 19, I think it's 19, it might be 20 now, rounds of sanctions put on by the West against them. They feel that their economy has been able to persevere, not just persevere, but to grow. They've found new markets. They've found either to broaden trading ties and commercial ties with already established partners, or they've found new partners. Rather than saying looking westward, the Russians, I think, in terms of commerce and trade, have realized that they need to look southward and eastward. They shifted their gas exports from Europe to China, no small part with the Nord Stream pipelines being destroyed. But with that shift, the Russians are never going to turn back towards Europe for the lion's share of their gas sales. Why would they? China will consume many times more volumes of gas than Europe ever could. Through shadow fleets and shell companies, they've avoided sanctions. If people are following what's occurring, say, with India, where the latest round of American sanctions were supposed to just really cut Russian oil sales to India, you've seen that's not happening. You've seen a drop in Russian oil sales to India, a drop in Indian imports of Russian oil, but you see the Russians and the Indians figuring a way out around it, and it's very likely that in a couple months you'll have a volume of Russian oil exports to India equaling what it was prior to these sanctions. You've seen on their domestic industrial capacity, not just militarily, where their factories and their plants are outproducing the entire Western military industrial complex in orders of magnitude of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, whatever you want to talk about, tanks, shells, drones, what have you. The Russians are outproducing the Western military industrial complex in orders of magnitude, again, of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But also, too, domestically, their industry has been able to produce what the Russians have lost due to the sanctions. So where initially you may have had some empty shelves in Russia, from all the reports I can gather, including people who have been there and people who have family in Russia, the Russian economy, by and large, has made up for the shortfalls coming from sanctions through domestic production. It's the point that the Russian economy is doing so well. It's not just the military, but their domestic economy, that they're exporting, that they're selling what they're producing, while they're in the midst of, essentially the largest conventional war since World War II. Technology-wise, it seems as if they have outperformed or out advanced the West, particularly when it comes to things like ballistic missiles. I mean, they have missiles now that just can't be countered. The Patriot missile system, which is the U.S. Air defense missile system, which is supposedly the most superior or the best missile interceptor in the world, along with the Israeli systems, only has about an 8% success rate against the Russian ballistic missiles. And so you've seen this greater progression against the West along all lines of effort. And then the Russians view the Ukrainians as being divided. They view the West as being divided. They look at, conflicting poll numbers, as we all do, coming out of Ukraine that say 70% of Ukrainians want peace, but 70% don't want this peace plan, as well as the issues that Ukraine has with regards to recruiting, with their manpower issues. They see the disunity in the West and in the United States over Ukraine. So politically, they view themselves as being in a position of strength compared to their adversaries, whether it just be Ukraine or NATO in total. You know, the domestic political position of the Russians is one that is also something that I think is misunderstood here in the West. The war remains popular in Russia. Putin, the Russian president, remains popular. If there's any pressure that's being put on to Vladimir Putin and his government, it's coming from their right. It's from those who think the war is not being fought hard enough, those who don't understand why the war hasn't been won already, those who feel that this Russian government is being too easy on the Ukrainians. And so there is not this pressure on them to end the war through negotiations, as most in the West determined that there would be by this time. However, saying all of that, there are many reasons why I believe the Russians are not in this position of certainty that either they or others feel that they are in. I'll go through those kind of quickly, and then we could kind of get into that more in the Q&A if you like. But you know, the Russians right now are in the best position possible. They've essentially they've got everything that they wanted, and their goal was not to conquer and occupy all of Ukraine, to keep the war going now, just to maybe fill out the two provinces that they haven't fully occupied, Zaporizhia and Kherson, which was not their stated goal to begin with. Became a goal in the fall of 2022, but certainly in the initial invasion in February 2022, the occupation of Zaporizhia and Kherson did not seem to be their goal. Or at least the full occupation of it. Other aspects of this is that the ostensible reason, or one of the reasons for Russia's invasion, was to preempt or to deter a future war with NATO. And of course, the idea, the escalation of this war, that this war could get to a point where that war with NATO becomes a reality, is something that the Russians are keen to avoid. Again, if your goal was to have this war so that you don't have a larger war with NATO in the future, then why continue to take the risk of that war becoming that larger war that you were trying to avoid? There's also too this reality of the uncertainty of war. Right? This idea that somehow wars are going to go the way that you plan, that we have as man or as mankind, we have agency over war, and that war will continue to go the way we think it's going to go, that we can manage it, that we can control it when it's a superhuman force. And the historical examples of those, of course, are right, Legion. But this idea that war is uncertain. And I think the Russians are wise enough, or should be wise enough, to recognize the uncertainty of warfare, that just because something is going this way now does not mean in a year, 2, 3, 4 years' time, it will be going that way, let alone the axiom that is a cliche because it's so true, that war is a breeding ground of unintended consequences, is something that should weigh very heavily on the Russians. The political costs. Look, foreign wars have political costs. Not all, but most foreign wars have political costs. And you can make an argument that from the Russians' perspective, this is not a foreign war. But at some point, there is going to be a political cost on the Russian government for the body bags coming home, from the families that are dealing with this, from even to the labor shortages that may come from supporting a 1.7 million man army, or whatever the new Russian goal for that is. There's also economic dangers. This idea that the Russian economy is doing well now, that the Russian economy has done very well in spite of the sanctions, that the Russians prepared very well for this war economically, industrially, monetarily, and that they have gotten to this point and defied all the experts in the West who said by now they would have collapsed. Well, there's danger with wartime economies. You've already seen some of this with inflation, with high interest rates. Certainly cuts in services. Right now, the Russians are spending a third of their federal budget on the war in Ukraine. That's about three times, close to three and a half times what they were spending on their military prior to the invasion in 2022. I mean, all these things can have an effect. And then if you're running a wartime economy, if you're running essentially a war state, you're going to have issues of corruption. You're going to have issues of productivity stagnation. Everything in your economy is going to be geared for the war. And so the cost to your public, the cost to the quality of life, the cost to, again, productivity, to progress is going to be affected by the fact that you are in a wartime economy. The military industry will determine what the needs are of the people. The people's needs won't be what determines what the industry and the economy are producing. And then, sanctions have been mitigated, they've been avoided, they've been dodged, however you want to describe it. But for how long can you continue to sell your commodities at a discount for? And finally, the last thing is a cultural one. How long do the Russian people want to be cut off from the West? As much as I was saying before about the Russians facing south and eastward now with their commerce and trade, I think culturally they view themselves as part of Europe. And so, for how long can they be cut off from from the West, essentially, whether it be education, whether it be travel, whether it be connections to family, et cetera. These things, I think, all have a cost that cumulative makes it very dangerous for the Russians to continue this war, particularly when they have the upper hand now and they can get essentially most of what they want. And then, I'm sorry, finally, the big thing I think for the Russians, though, is this idea of what happens if Ukraine collapses, right? What happens if the house of cards that is the Ukrainian government, whether there's a political collapse, an economic collapse, or a military collapse, or two of three or three of three, what happens then? Now you have a failed state on your border. Now you have essentially Syria or Afghanistan on your border. And then how much of Ukraine do you have to occupy? Something that you didn't want to do. Your goal wasn't the occupation, the conquering of all of Ukraine. Now you have to do how much of that? And does that mean that Romania and Poland come in from the West to occupy other parts of Ukraine? Who takes control of Ukraine in a situation like that? If you lose this government in Kyiv, who's going to take over? And I think most people believe that who's going to take over is the far right, the very people you're trying to keep out, the people you're trying to denazify Ukraine from, very likely would be the ones who would succeed or who would benefit from any type of collapse. So, I mean, there's all these questions that are out there for the Russians that I think would push them or should be pushing them to negotiate. For the Ukrainians, the issues I think are a lot more starker, or a lot clearer. I think they have their manpower crisis that people are aware of. You just had these reports that came out in the last week or so where the Ukrainian government is saying, look, we've got more than 2 million people who are avoiding to draft. We have more than 200,000 deserters. And I think those numbers are probably lower end estimates, right? And these are things that if you've been following this, you know that there's a manpower issue. That you've had this massive population loss of, again, whether it's 4 million people internally or 6 million people externally, more than 5 million people who are now in Russian controlled areas. So just even you start looking at that, the Ukrainians are millions of people short of what they need to run their economy. You have issues with support from the West. The West promised the West promised Ukraine that it would defeat Russia with them, that it would provide everything that Ukraine needed to defeat Russia, and the West has failed to do that. And the whole idea too that this war was always unwinnable for Ukraine. I think the description I've always held on to about this war was that it's a war that Ukraine can't win and Russia can't lose. Right. And so this idea then of the only way that Ukraine was ever going to win was the introduction of a NATO army into Ukraine. And I mean, a full army, like 3 to 5 corps of mechanized and armored divisions and all the associated aircraft and missile forces and naval fleets, et cetera. That was never going to happen. And we know it's never going to happen because it didn't happen. But also, too, when we start looking at the negotiations and the security guarantees that are out there or supposedly being offered by the Europeans to the Ukrainians, we see that almost no nations are willing to put troops into Ukraine. Britain and France said they would, but even what they're offering doesn't seem like it's much of anything. So the support that the Ukrainians had counted on never materialized, and they should have no reason to believe it ever will. Politically, they're dealing with high levels of corruption. The majority of Ukrainians understand why men are avoiding the draft. And polls show that there's very low levels down, below 20% of Ukrainians say that they are themselves willing to fight in this war. You see other poll numbers out there that show that the political situation is not stable in Ukraine. You'll see numbers saying 60% support Zelensky, but less than 20% would vote for him. You see things such as there's a poll that came out in December. It says 72% of Ukrainians are ready to approve a peace plan that would include freezing the situation behind the current front line with security guarantees for Ukraine. At the same time, 75% reject a plan that would, among other things, include the withdrawal of troops from Donbass, restrictions of the Ukrainian army, and would not contain specific security guarantees. So you look at these two relatively conflicting numbers that seem contradictory. And so it's hard to get a gauge for what the political level of support for this war, let alone the government, is in Ukraine, because well, there's been no elections, but also, too, the actions of the people, whether it's the continued displacement or refugees, whether it's the lack of support for the military in terms of avoiding the draft, as well as these public opinion numbers that just don't show that there's a solid, stable foundation of support for the government, let alone the war. You also have issues where if anyone has seceded politically in Ukraine because of this war, it's been the right wing. You've had political assassinations in Ukraine. You have factionalism, and there's always kind of floating out there this idea of there being the possibility of a coup. And I kind of brushed over it quickly, but the corruption is really a big deal. This corruption scandal that brought down the Minister of Energy as well as the Ukrainian Chief of Staff in December, that corruption scandal was about these people in power who were willing to hold off on putting air defenses and defense systems around Ukrainian energy facilities in order to get better kickbacks. So as the Ukrainian people were going into their fourth winter of Russia attacking and turning off their energy and them freezing at night, the highest levels of power in their country are not doing what they can to protect those power plants because they're waiting for better kickbacks. Right. So, I mean, the issues here are multiple. You've got other issues as well. You've got issues with the dependence on Western foreign assistance. The Ukrainians have about $140 billion budget gap for the next 2 years. The EU is going to provide about $100 billion of that in a loan, the details of which are very sketchy. And then there's still this whole thing of, well, they're still $40 billion short. So all this makes you think of a house of cards. And I think this is the most important point for me with regards to Ukraine is this idea of how do many American proxy wars end? They end through the political collapse / economic collapse rather than true military defeat. You see this in Vietnam, you see this in Afghanistan. Certainly there was military defeat going on. Both the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were defeating the South Vietnamese on the battlefield. Same with the Taliban was defeating the Afghan government forces. But the reality of those collapses come from a panic that ensues by the fear of the money being turned off. That these essentially were corrupt patronage networks that we have built in these countries, that they were a house of cards. And as soon as the fear of the money not showing up became resident, a great panic ensued and the house of cards collapsed. And looking at Ukraine, how can you say that might not be the same way? How can you say that could be any different? I mean, so those are all the things I look at as you analyze this. The high risk of collapse, and again, I think it's probably more economic and political than military for the Ukrainians. A lack of unified support from the West. This reality that the system there is a house of cards, again, similar to other American proxy wars. The Ukrainians were never going to be able to win the battlefield, and the support from the West that they were promised never came and never will come. And just the reality that the more they delay, the more land the Russians take. So the more they delay, the more that the Russians advance, the worse deal they're going to get. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing to understand, but looking at this, you see the delays causing more and more problems for the Ukrainians in terms of being able to effectively accept a deal in the future. And then you get back to the human state. What's the chief reason why the Ukrainians should end the war is because they can't win the war and their people are suffering. Their people are being destroyed. Their land is being ruined. What I mean? And so for that reason alone, you say, my God, stop this war. I'm already at a half hour here. Like I said, I realized as I was preparing for this that I had bitten off with my description more than I could speak to in a half hour's time. So I'm gonna not speak to a few other things I had on here, and we can get to those in the Q&A. I just want to get to this idea of what a year from now this will look like. And it's very dystopian. It very much is a war that is reflective of the past, but also symptomatic of the future. So, if people recall the Iraq War, what that devolves into 8 years of warfare that kills a million people, and you have what's called the War of the Cities. And I think that's what you're going towards here with the Russia-Ukraine war, that as you have this war of infrastructure that's currently occurring, war on infrastructure that's currently occurring, you're going to have more of a war on the cities. So missile and drone strikes on population targets, maybe not so much to knock out the other side or to hurt the other side's morale, but to boost your own, right? To bolster your own. So the idea that you're going to have more spectacular attacks, you're going to have more attempts at assassinations, you're going to have more demonstrations of weapons. And we've seen all that, right? In the last month or so, the demonstration use of the Reshnik missile again by the Russians, the attack on President Putin's compound by Russian drones. So that type of behavior is going to become more foundational to the war as both sides, again, not try and knock the other side out because they know that's not possible, but try and boost the morale of their own public, as well as their backers, right? So for the Ukrainians, trying to do these demonstrations that will continue Western support for them. And then this idea of automation. Right. And this is something that Volodymyr Zelensky himself has spoke about, not just the drones, but the introduction of artificial intelligence. You're seeing drones that are capable of attacking other drones now. Essentially, what you have is a state of warfare where it is small unit level. You're talking about Russians advancing on motorcycle and on ATV, on units no bigger than a squad, because the drones are so prevalent and the drones bring such a degree of force and lethality that there is essentially a dead man zone that exists between the two armies that only can be infiltrated by small units of men. And that's why one of the reasons why you see the Russian advance being so slow. But this idea of the drone warfare becoming, it's already the dominant aspect of this war, but becoming something that we simply can't apprehend at this time or can't predict. A Black Mirror episode, if you're familiar with that television show, it's very likely. And the dangers of that, then, where that goes to, if you're going to have autonomous hunter-killer drones that don't need human input, where that can go to. And so this automation of warfare is something that a lot of people speak about, and I think in a year or so's time, we'll see become a real concrete reality in the Ukraine-Russia war. And then you've almost got this predestined aspect to it, where the actions of all sides are making a larger conflict possible, right? So whether it's the actions of the Russians pushing against NATO, the actions of NATO pushing against the Russians, right? Pox on both houses, but the idea that we're creating a reality of our own making here. And certainly, if we want to get into discussions about the reasons for these wars, say the encroachment of NATO up onto Russia, the provocations that led to this war, we can get into that. But just looking at, say, in the last year, all the things that have happened, whether they real true or not, whether they actually happened or not, Russian drone incursions into Poland, whether or not they actually happened, it doesn't matter. The Poles have now put in air defenses. The NATO has fighter squadrons that are taking off. I mean, like on a moment's notice. I mean, so all that knife's edge type tension and danger is there. And so we're heading towards a larger war here that again seems almost predestined by the actions. And I think that danger is, along with the suffering of the Ukrainian people and all the things we spoke about, but the danger of a larger war is something that is very real. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't happen. But I think that danger of escalation, that this game this madness between the sides here is something that with every year that it doesn't happen, then it becomes more likely in the next year. And I think that, of course, is maybe the greatest reason for ending this war. So I appreciate everyone taking the time to come here tonight and listen to me. Happy to take questions, and I'll throw it back over to John.
Thank you so much, Matthew Hoh, for that thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. And before we do get into the Q&A, as I said earlier, by the way, throughout, as you've been talking, I've seen people entering and being admitted into this webinar for the last half an hour. So we have quite a crowd here. I appreciate everybody that's come. And for those that came more recently, there's so many people here, we just cannot do the yellow hand and calling on people for questions. So if you have any questions or comments about Mr. Ho's presentation and this issue, this war in general, please put it in the chat, and our tech administrator, Mary Ellen, will be picking questions and comments, kept very brief, maybe 40 seconds at the most. If you write, that'll keep you brief, because we want to get to as many as possible. And just before we do that, a couple of announcements, just upcoming things that are important that we're also offering. Monday, January 26th, there'll be a webinar titled Militarism versus the Care Economy and Degrowth. And that's with Harris Grumman, Anna Prouty, and Juan Carlos de Blas. And information on that will be on the Massachusetts Peace Action website. All of the upcoming webinars and the past ones, the recordings of them, are on that website. Secondly, Thursday, February 12th will be the Ukraine Peace Campaign part of Massachusetts Peace Action, our next webinar, and that is about the 4th anniversary of the Ukraine war, which is February 24th. But on February 12th, the webinar is with Professor Ivana Nikolic Hughes of Columbia University, chemistry professor, and she's the director of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And she will speak on the topic, End the Ukraine War Now, or it could end up in nuclear war. And I think that that possibility was discussed or mentioned at the end of Mr. Ho's presentation, some of the dangers if this war continues. And lastly, On Tuesday, February 24th, as I said, the fourth anniversary of the Ukraine war and the Russians' invasion, we are organizing statewide protests in hopefully Boston, Worcester, Springfield, and Northampton, calling for continued negotiations to end this war, not escalation. And if you'd like to participate, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Paul Shannon. And we have a form to fill out. He'll tell you more also about a webinar with a very important speaker coming up. Paul.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you so much, Matthew, for your presentation. February 24th, the fourth anniversary of the start of this war. Of course, this war started long before February 24th, 2022. It really started back in 1990. It has been going on for a long time, and the issues involved in it are basically hidden from the U.S. public in a way that Noam Chomsky had said he had never seen in his life. In that situation, it makes it difficult for people to act, but we are going to try on the 24th of February to have rallies, as John said, throughout the state in various locations to demand that this war must end, and it must end now. It will not be a perfect ending, but the continuation of this war is too dangerous for everyone involved, including us. You may know that Ukraine has attacked nuclear facilities in Russia. We're very fortunate that those attacks did not lead to nuclear war, because part of Russia's nuclear position on when they would go to war include the things that Ukraine, with NATO's full support and intelligence gathering, has done. This war must end now. If you agree, and if you live in Massachusetts, we're asking you to take a look at the form, which is a very simple form. It just says that on February 24th, I will show up at one of these rallies to end this war. Mary Ellen is good enough to have put what the form says, but she will also put a link to the form in the chat so that you can open it. And if you are willing to turn up at one of these events on February 24th, the world needs Americans to stand up and insist that this war will end. So please, when she puts the link in the chat, please open it. Just fill in the form, says I'll be there. We will let you know the exact location of these rallies as time goes on. So if you look at the bottom of this this form, I just want to point out that there's a section here, how can I help? That is irrelevant. That we put this form together at the last minute and forgot to take that section out. All by signing the form, you're saying is that you will participate in one of these rallies. I hope you will consider doing it. We cannot let the leaders of this country and the leaders of European countries who are insisting that the war continue, we cannot let them win the day, continue winning the day at the expense of Ukrainians, at the expense of world peace, at the expense of total instability in Europe, because what's needed is a new agreement in Europe, a common security agreement whereby all the security needs of all states, Russia, Ukraine, all the European countries are taken into consideration, and a framework of respect for each other's security needs, which could have happened right after the end of the Cold War, that is the end goal here of mass peace action, and we hope you will join us in that goal. Also, on the night of the 24th, Stephen Kinzer, the columnist for the Globe, will be doing a webinar for us, and we'll be getting you information on that. So I think we should get back to Matthew and questions that people have, John.
Yep. I'm just going to add one more thing. By the way, Stephen Kinzer is one of the most outspoken and well-known journalists who has questioned this war from the start and opposed it. So don't miss that webinar on February 24th in the evening. And I just want to say, Paul didn't mention that if for any reason you can't make it at noon to a rally, work or whatever, other commitments, you can help enormously by forwarding the information we send you to other people who might be able to come. So please help us by passing the word if you can't be there yourself. Please sign up on the sign up form. And now, Mary Ellen, would you like to pick the first question from the chat?
Yes, there's some lots of good questions. Some folks have posted more than one. Let me select one that kind of caught my eye from Hiroki Nakanishi. Now it's a bit speculative, but he asks, how much could a potential blue wave in the midterms or an impeachment trial of the president after the election contribute to the war, either a win or a loss? What are your thoughts on that? And you'll need to unmute.
Okay,
Oh,
there we go.
got it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. We've seen some of that already. There's comments from Donald Trump saying how he was pressured against Russia in his first term because of the Russiagate aspect, because of the impeachment. Certainly, I think the idea that if there's a blue wave, if the Democrats take the House, or I can't see them taking the Senate, but you know, uh, the idea, though, is that you already have great support for Ukraine in the Congress. When you look at, say, some of the things put forward, say, in the Senate by Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, you see they've got a veto-proof majority. 70 senators or so willing to co-sponsor sanctions acts against Russia. In the House as well, a bit more divided, but certainly majority support from both the Republicans and the Democrats, enough to get it over any type of hurdle. I don't know if they'd have a veto-proof majority in the House to go against Donald Trump on these things, but certainly it would be enough to pressure him. That certainly it comes down to this calculus then, I think, for Donald Trump, of how much this is it worth for him, and how much of this does it affect other how much of this affects other aspects of his agenda. You have among not just corporate Democrats, but among progressive Democrats, unfortunately, a belief in this war, that this is a war of good and evil, right? That this is a war of democracy versus autocracy. I think whoever runs on the Democratic ticket in 28 will be pounding this drum, just as Joe Biden, for his reelection campaign, saw Ukraine as signature issue for him. If people recall, in September of 2023, Joe Biden's first reelection campaign ad is as Joe Biden as wartime president, Joe Biden visiting Kyiv during the war, right? I mean, so this is something for the Democrats that has been part of their identity for more than a decade. This conflation of the Republicans and Donald Trump with the Russians and Vladimir Putin, this idea of a good war, this idea of Zelensky as Churchill, all these tropes, right? All these themes, as well as in the larger Russia Gate hysteria, has made it almost impossible for the Democrats to walk away from this. And I would say same with for most of the Europeans as well, that their political identity is so tied up in this. And the idea of a foreign war, a foreign adversary, the new Hitler, if you will, being able to distract from domestic problems. So for both sides of the Atlantic, the Europeans, whether it's individual governments or the EU, for the EU, they view this war as the pathway to the European Union having its own army. That was just brought up again last week, this need for 100,000 man European army. Well, in order to justify that, you have to have an enemy like Russia. You have to have the great threat from the East. I mean, so on both sides of the Atlantic, I think the issue of Russia as determinative in politics is as relevant now as it was a few years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago.
Thank you. Actually, following up on that, I see another question that I'm actually is always on my mind as well. How do we best counter this narrative that, if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, he's going to
Yeah.
go on to Berlin and Paris. In other words, if we must fight, else he will see it as weakness and just invade Europe. That's from
Yeah,
William
it's a,
Astor.
yeah, Marianne, that's a narrative that we hear all the time because it's an effective narrative, and we've heard that all of our entire lives, right? Again, I said before about the new Hitler, this idea that it's always Munich, right? It's always Neville Chamberlain. It's always this idea of appeasement. It's always this, didn't you learn the lessons of history in 11th grade? You have to stand up to these Hitlers. And whether that's Saddam Hussein, whether it's Ho Chi Minh, whoever it be. I mean, how many have we all had in our lifetimes? Hitlers. I mean, it's an effective narrative, and that's why it gets utilized over and over again. You certainly can try and confront that with facts. But we know how far that will often go with many people. I think it all determines upon who the person you're having this conversation with. If they are a blue, no matter who, or they are a Lindsey Graham neoconservative type, uh, I don't know how much trying to argue with them is going to get you anywhere, right? But if it's someone else, I think is this idea of bringing up this idea of how often have you heard this before? I mean, you could certainly talk about, look, Russia's been able to conquer not even 10% of Ukraine in the last 4 years. And you're saying they're going to march on Warsaw and Berlin and Paris, and then they're going to cross the channel and take London. I mean, you could certainly go that route as well and speak about just how incapable the Russians have been to conquer more than they have already in Ukraine over 4 years at great cost, and that there's somehow this great threat we're supposed to be afraid of. But I think the more compelling argument is to ask people to investigate it themselves and say, how often have you heard this before? And does this make sense to you? And then once they're open to that, and I think once they have this willingness to disbelieve what they hear on a drumbeat from their politicians, from the media, from Hollywood, then I think is the time that you say, okay, this is what was happening. Do you know in 19, Jim Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch further, and then kind of give them the history. And I think that's a more effective way to approach them emotionally first than just with a whole torrent of facts.
Thank you. Lawrence Quart asks, again, a question about a prediction. What do you see for Ukraine after the RF victory? Do you envision a single entity, or will it be split up between the neighbors, which have historical claims to the territory? And finally, will the Poles finally get rid of the Nazis?
Well, the and what was the last part there, Marilyn?
Will the Poles finally get rid of the Nazis?
Um, I don't know. I think that that's pretty ingrained. A lot of that type of, to be polite, call it ultra nationalism. But no, certainly there's a fascism, a right wing Nazi ethno supremacist aspect, which exists. You can find it probably in most any part of the world, but it really is quite forceful in Eastern Europe. But in terms of predictions, I always like to defer to Yogi Berra, who said that predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. And, so what would it look like? It all depends upon what the progress is. I think you can have, if there is a negotiated settlement, you can have essentially a section of Ukraine that has been ceded to Russia. You could potentially have a section of Ukraine, again, the areas essentially that the Russians are occupying, that become an autonomous federation, as was thought to be possible through the Minsk II Accords. Whether the Russians would trust the West to go along with something like that again, I don't know. I certainly wouldn't trust the West. But, then there's this idea if you don't have a negotiated settlement and you fight it out, what does it look like? And if you have a collapse, say whether it's military, economic, political, whatever, the lines come down and the Russians have nothing in front of them but open land, how far do they go? Right? This wasn't it wasn't their goal to occupy all of Ukraine. Their goal was never to conquer Ukraine like a conventional World War II style victory. The goals were always much more limited. So why would the Russians, knowing the dangers of occupying a country, particularly the farther west they go into Ukraine, and I'm going to simplify it here, but the farther west they go into Ukraine, they go into more Ukrainian speaking lands, right? So the lands that they currently control are predominantly Russian speaking. The farther west they go, with the exception, say, of Odessa or something like that, they're moving into land that they're going to have, it's going to be hostile. And now they're not going to be occupying, but they're going to have insurgency, right? I mean, as well, then, if again, your idea, but the Russian idea was we're going to launch this war in an effort to avoid a larger war in the future with NATO. Well, now then you have given NATO its reason for existence, right? Kiev becomes the new Jerusalem, right? And the possibility of NATO fading away, and this is and I should have said this at the beginning. Everything I say tonight, it's all predicated on how Donald Trump feels when he wakes up in the morning. So whether or not there's a NATO a year from now, Greenland's flying the stars and stripes, who knows, right? But say if we try and keep this in a rational and I know that's kind of silly to say when we're dealing with a lot of this, particularly Trump, but a rational outlook. I mean, what then? I mean, how far would the Russians advance? How much land would they want to take? And then this risk, then, as was stated, and I said it in my thing as well. If you have this collapse, do the Poles and Romanians come into Ukraine then to take territory that they have historical claim to, right? I mean, this idea that there has been solid boundaries there since the beginning of time, I don't think anyone says that. So this idea then that you then have advancing armies from Poland and Romania advancing towards the Russians, man, that's a really scary proposition, right? So, it's hard to imagine what it looks like. And then if you have essentially a failed state, like something akin to Syria, Afghanistan, my God, you have a nation that's awash in not just convention, not just small arms, but the heaviest weaponry available. And so you could see this path where Ukraine fractures and becomes a state where you have various warlords. Or you could see, as I said earlier, this idea that those who have benefited the most politically in Ukraine from this war are the Nazis, right? Are the ultranationalists, are the far right, right? The very people that the Russians are trying to politically neutralize, they've gained the most in Ukraine, I believe. Do they take power? Right? I mean, and then, I mean, so all the things that are in front of us that we can speculate towards, and I'm sure everyone here can come up with like 5 or 6 other examples of where this could go. Uh, all of that is a place that none of us wants to go to. If anyone thinks that a collapsed Ukraine with the Russians moving west, the Poles and the Romanians moving east, with warlords taking power or the right taking power, with millions upon millions more people fleeing Ukraine, if anyone thinks that's a good idea, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, so this is again the pertinence, the need for a negotiated settlement to avoid the speculations, the predictions that we can come up with of what it might look like. I mean, this idea, as I said before, what I think it might look like a year from now in terms of increased attacks on the cities, increased automation, closer to a war between NATO and Russia. That's kind of almost best case for what it looks like if we don't get a negotiated settlement, and that's horrifying.
Indeed, it's quite horrifying given everything else going on as well. Let's see. Yeah, Alice Slater has brought this up. And again, it's, asking you, about narratives that we can use. How do we get the news out that Russia, along with China, have been urging the U.S. to
Mhm.
negotiate on their draft treaty?
Right.
They've been proposing this for years, and to ban weapons and war in space, and pledge on the 80th anniversary of World War never to be the first to put weapons in space.
It's not going to come through. And first, hi to Alice. It's not going to come through the corporate media or through our congressional offices. And we still bang on those because those have relevance and those have importance. But we recognize that information is spread through alternative means now, or independent means. So we back organizations like Mass Peace Action. We back organizations that are organizing, that are getting people out on the ground. But we also have to back independent media. We have to back independent journalists. We have to back various platforms out there, whether they're YouTube programs, podcasts, online magazines, what have you. This medium that we have here now, this scares the heck out of the ruling class. I mean, why did they want to get rid of TikTok, or why did they force TikTok to be sold to the Ellisons, right? It's because they're scared of this. They're scared of this medium because this allows us to inform, it allows us to educate, it allows us to organize, it allows us to cooperate or coordinate with one another, right? It allows us to mobilize. I mean, you look at the public opinion numbers on the Ukraine war. I mean, there was this great clip from about a year ago on CNN where you had, I don't even know who these guys are. Like most of you, you probably don't watch CNN either, but a lot of people still do. And particularly the ruling class watches CNN, and that bubble that they're in. And these two analysts, these two commentators on CNN, a poll number comes up that the vast majority of Americans, I think it was like close to 70% or more than 70% of Americans, support negotiations to end the Ukraine war. And these two guys on CNN couldn't believe it. They could not believe that a super majority of Americans supported ending the Ukraine war negotiations. One, because they're in their own bubble, and then it was disgusting. Then they went into, oh, all depends upon what people actually know, and then how the question's actually phrased, et cetera, et cetera. All they're trying to excuse away the reality of American public opinion on this war. And most Americans are not getting their information from the legacy platforms. They're not getting their information from the established media that, serves the ruling class. And so they are fighting against that, right? The established media, the elites, the ruling class, whatever you want to call these people in their institutions. And they are scared to death of this type of interaction, of this ability to get our own information, right? Of this ability to hear directly from the source. I mean, the genocide in Gaza is the best example of that. If you read the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, or watch CNN or Fox or MS Now or whatever it is they're calling it, you'd have no idea genocide was taking place there. You'd think this was some fair fight between two rival countries that's going on, rather than a genocide that is just the latest episode of ethnic cleansing that has been going on for 100 years. Right. I mean, so, long-winded, Alice, but and I appreciate it, but what you're saying there, because I agree so much with it. We have to fight these narratives asymmetrically, and we do that through the things that scare the hell out of the ruling class and the establishment, and it's through this type of medium.
Let's see. Donald Smith asks, and topic has come up elsewhere in the chat. Can you speak about the involvement of the CIA in the 2014 Maidan coup, and the support for the Azov Battalion and other provocations, and the cover-up, etc.?
That could be a whole webinar all in itself. This has been a war long wanted. Certainly the role of the CIA in Eastern Europe. We could just start at the end of the Cold War to keep it simple, but I'd be here all night going through that, right? I mean, it's a pervasive, dominant role. We know that in the lead up to the 2014 coup. You had mass American involvement. How much was CIA? How much was overt through cutout organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy? There was a mix there, but there was this effort that came on top of what were called what were called color revolutions. I think there were what, 7 or 8 of them. At one time, I used to know them all, but now I can't remember them. But like, right, the various efforts by the United States to ensure that it was the dominant power in the world. This all goes back to the George H.W. Bush administration and the understanding that the United States is the sole superpower and that the United States has primacy and that the efforts of every successive American administration will be to ensure that primacy. This goes back to what George Kennan says to Harry Truman back in 1947. When George Kennan says to Harry Truman, he says, Mr. President, the United States has 55% of the world's wealth, and we have less than 5% of the world's population. It will be the duty, the obligation of every successive administration to ensure that imbalance, right? To keep that imbalance alive. And then once we win the Cold War, so to speak, then this idea of maintaining that primacy has to come at all costs. And so what you have then is an effort that goes through the decades of the last 35 years to ensure that. And much of it comes through these color revolutions. We see one occur in Ukraine in 2004, I believe it was. But then again, of course, the one in 2014. And then once that occurs, the Ukraine is the Americans. It is particularly the CIA's. And you have seen this because the CIA has bragged about it. Both the Washington Post and the New York Times have written large pieces on the American CIA presence in Ukraine following 2014. I mean, literally dozens of CIA stations speckled throughout Ukraine. The idea that Ukraine was the outpost, not just for NATO, but for American intelligence activities against Russia, that's not something that we have to go find some obscure source for. Not something you have to go listen to some whistleblower talk about, or listen to, find some investigative independent journalist who's willing to speak about this. This is something that the CIA has bragged about. So their role in this has been foremost. And you've seen it in many other ways. They've been very influential, along with the British MI6. There's actually some competition there, I believe, between the CIA and MI6, including different camps within the Ukrainian government. But, this idea of Ukraine as a project and as it being the forward outpost of the West against Russia, this recalcitrant country that just won't give up. I mean, we are what, the fifth, sixth generation that have tried to subdue the Russians, right? Even longer if we were British. That goes back to the 1840s, 1850s, right? So this legacy that the CIA is carrying out, when you understand it in that light, it makes perfect sense what they did, no matter how immoral, counterproductive, illegal, etc. it was. And what else would you expect these people to do?
And the other thing I'm seeing in the chat is a number, people understandably, myself included, were sort of all wondering, what can we do, to stop this. One person says, can the UN be useful somehow? Jeff Barthold mentioned, okay, beyond going to protest, should we be running for office? Um, and do you have any thoughts on that? Something novel, perhaps, that we haven't thought of before.
I wish I did. I mean, I'll go back to the Dr. King quote I shared earlier, where Dr. King says, our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we all must protest. And I think that's what's key. You find what you're good at, you find out what you're best at, and you find the things that work, right? I think you do have to, because so much of the United States public is disengaged, because the corporate media, although again, most Americans aren't getting their information from the corporate media, it still has tremendous impact and sway. You know, as much as we can disagree on the effectiveness or the worthiness or the worthwhile of participating in electoral politics, to cede those arenas is a mistake, right? To give up those spaces is a mistake. So we have to have a presence there, but we have to, I think, try to find those spaces that asymmetrically we have the most effect. And that's through, I think, the means and mechanisms was saying earlier, answering Alice's question, you know, through independent media. Through this type of technology that we're talking here about. 5 years ago we could have done we did things like this, but it wasn't great. 10 years ago, I don't, I mean, and when I first started doing commentary, go back 15 years, you had to go either on a landline or you had to go to a studio. I mean, so what we've been given technologically and then culturally as an aside, as a complement to that over these last 15 years is something I don't think we really truly understand. But there's a lot of things that we're up against. If people you've probably all experienced this already, the insidiousness of artificial intelligence. If you ask AI about any of these wars, they're going to give you what Washington, D.C. wants you to know about these wars. I was doing research on the Iraq War, and something I took part in, and then of course, so I know a great deal about. And the information that the Iraq, or that the AI, that ChatGPT was giving me back about the Iraq War, was propaganda. And so when I said, "What are your sources?" It said, "Oh, the U.S. Army's history of the war, David Petraeus's biography." And I said, "This is nuts." And I said to the machine, I said, "Why are you doing this? You know this is not. You just told me you know this information is not correct. Why are you doing this?" And ChatGPT told me that its programming instructs it to defer to institutional structures versus historical accuracy, right? And so that's what we're up against. Who's going to control AI, right? And AI is going to be what tells everybody what they know, and it's going to be authoritative, and it's going to be run by Google and Apple and Microsoft and Sam Altman and Elon Musk, and okay, we're up against that. Then how do we compete against it? And so it's a big question. It's a hard question, but I'll defer to what Dr. King said, that we have to find what we're best at, where we fit best, and do that. But we have to do something. And the other aspect too, I'll put a plug in for the events, the rallies that Mass Peace Action is organizing. We have to do it together. We have to be together in this. Like, this technology is terrific. We're able to do this kind of thing like this. But the reality is that what gives us solidarity, what gives us force, what gives us energy is our unity, right? And our presence among one another. And so what, you go out to these rallies and everything, and you're making a point, you're showing people that you're willing to put yourself out there. You're demonstrating that. But then the other aspect of it is that we're there together. And I think that's incredibly important, because this idea of separating us and individualizing us, that's a key factor. That's a key effort that's always been utilized by the powers that be, but I think are going to become increasingly more effective as we, remain tied to our phones, on our computers, et cetera. This idea that we're not together, and if we're not together, it's much easier to split us apart, break us up, deny our ability to do anything in mass, et cetera.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up with that, one unifying thought that I think was predominant on the right, but I think it's resonating with a lot of people these days, is that um, all of these armaments that had been sent to Ukraine do have been perceived as coming at the expense of, our communities. So maybe that's not so much relevant these days since we're getting Europe to pay for everything supposedly. But that has been one unifying message that I think a lot of people resonate with. Let's
Right.
see what else we got here. Oh yes,
I
one
just
person.
Can I just jump in for a sec,
Yes, please.
Mary Ellen? Just
It's
want to let everybody
8:23, I know.
know, including Mary Ellen, we have 6 minutes left. We're taking this right to the wire because Matthew Hoh has been really giving us his time and his passion and his information. We really appreciate it a lot. Let's wrap it up with one or two more comments and questions, and we'll
My
call it an
thoughts
evening. Go
exactly.
ahead.
My thoughts exactly. Thank you, John. So one person did ask, what is your assessment of the danger of nuclear war? And we can also make another plug for an upcoming webinar on February 12th with an expert on nuclear disarmament, Ivana Hughes from Columbia University.
It's I'm more concerned about a nuclear war that originates with a conflict with China than I am with Russia, although certainly my concerns are there. Uh, that concern is based upon what I know about war games that have taken place in the United States, where very often, almost always, the United States loses to China, and very often the war goes nuclear by the U.S.'s own actions. Um, I think the same could occur with Russia as well. Although I think the who would fire the first nuclear weapon is debatable. I think the reality of Russia's change to their employment of nuclear weapons, how they're said that they would utilize them. Against in response to anything that jeopardizes essentially their command and control structure, which is how I read their doctrine, is incredibly dangerous. There's no way to know what type of missiles being fired at your headquarters or at your bunkers, right? No idea if that's a conventional or a nuclear missile until it actually goes off. And so for the Russians to put out very clearly, like, we're not going to take the chance, we're going to treat everything that is a that we may treat everything that comes at our command and control structure as something that is existential, which essentially means we're going to knock out your command and control structure with nuclear weapons, which the United States has the capacity to do, including through our ballistic missile submarines, something the Russians don't have the capacity to do. It's very dangerous. There's a great imbalance in the nuclear order. This will only get worse when New START expires next month. But certainly the ability of the United States to launch first strikes against other states, Russia, China, whoever, is unmatched. Our ability, particularly say of our ballistic missile submarines, to launch first strikes and take out Russian or Chinese command and control structures, things that 10 years ago only our ICBMs would have been capable of doing, is something that has cut the amount of time that the Russians or the Chinese have to respond from a half hour to 15 minutes. I mean, and so that's the imbalance that we're looking at right now. So the tensions and the apprehensions and the anxieties of the Russians and the Chinese are correctly, rightly high, particularly as the United States refuses to have a no first strike doctrine, and particularly as our war games show that we will use nuclear weapons, or as we have generals and admirals talk about usable nuclear weapons. And so I think that's why you see the Russians rolling out a whole new catalog of doomsday weapons, as the Russian president describes them. But if you look at what's common among these new Russian nuclear weapons, the Poseidon torpedo, I'm blanking on the name of the cruise missile that's got a nuclear reactor in it so it can fly for weeks or months or indefinitely. These are all weapons these are all weapons that exist with the idea that they're going to be utilized after the Russian leadership has been decapitated. And so that's what the Russians view. That's what they think. They really do believe, rightfully or wrongly, that the Americans are not just willing, but they're capable of launching decapitation strikes with nuclear weapons in order to win a nuclear war because, one, the Americans have the technology, they have the armament, and they seem to have the willingness because we talk about it. And so the danger of nuclear war is, I agree with almost everyone else who talks about this, right? It's as bad or as worse or as horrifying as it's ever been. And so this idea that you've got a war in Eastern Europe between these powers and everything we know about warfare and how it can have, again, unintended consequences. And this is the status, this is the foundation of the relationship of nuclear power between these countries. And you're going to have this war going on, and you don't think these two things might cross over at some point? That is a terrifying thing to understand. And that's the reality, I think, of what we're against here, as well as all the other things we know about these. It's called an escalation ladder. You go up it or you can come down it. There's no side to side. And we continue to go up it. And it's what we're watching here is, essentially a game for fools and madmen. And the provocation, and one more thing I do want to say about this, is this willingness of the United States and the West to continue to poke people in the chest, even as the fruits of our militarism have been failures. And just even in the last 2 years, you look about at the capacity, the capabilities of, say, the American military. The American military has to retreat from the American Navy has to retreat from the Red Sea, not once, but twice against the Houthis. The American military has to effectively carry out this theatrical bombing of Iran with B-2 bombers because either the Israelis were about to use nuclear weapons or the Americans and Israelis were going to run out of air defense interceptors against Iranian ballistic missiles. So we can't beat the Houthis. We can't produce enough missiles to fight Iran. How are we going to fight China? And that's everything that everyone in Washington, D.C. seems to want. And then the final thing about all this is we know because of New York Times reporting, and if people haven't read this, I think it was by Adam Entos last March or last April in the Times, where the Times, Entos, described how something that we all knew, but the Americans wanted to put it out there for some reason. It was the American generals who were fighting the Russian generals in Ukraine. So the big arrow movements of the Ukrainian war, particularly, say, the 2023 Ukrainian offensive against the Russians, that calamity, uh, that was being commanded by American generals in Germany. So what you have then is you essentially have Russian generals defeating American generals on the battlefield. So tactically, operationally, we can't defeat the Houthis. Or industrially, we can't produce enough missiles to fight Iran for more than 12 days. And then actually, in terms of our generals, they defeated by the Russians on the battlefields of Ukraine. And yet we're walking around poking everyone in the chest. And so what happens then when we do get into this war with China, say in particular, how does it not go nuclear? How do those war games not prove true where the United States is up against the wall, losing, and hey, we've got these nukes, we've got an advantage here, let's use them. And so that's, I'm very long-winded, as I always am, but that's where I see the state of nuclear war potentially being and why it is such a horrible thing to contemplate.
Thank you. Very, very sobering, but very informative information. And I think since we're just over 8:30, I'm going to turn it over to John for the closing.
Thank you, Mary Ellen, for fielding all the chat questions and all that. Thank you, Matthew Hoh. I'm going to ask everybody still on the call here, put your hands together. Nobody will hear it, but we're giving a sitting ovation to Matthew Hoh. I felt your passion was rising for the whole hour and a half, and you could go another hour and a half talking about what you were just talking about, the peril, the danger, of miscalculation, of American arrogance poking people in the chest, all of that. We need to stop it. We need to unite. Thank you for harping on that point, which we believe in so strongly here. Thank you for your time and your passion and your caring.
Yeah,
Thank
Thank
you.
thank
you.
you, John.
Thank you all for being here. By the way, Matthew Hoh has a Substack. Follow him there. Eisenhower Media Network. You can find more information about him there. Want to say any other places where your work is
No,
can
I mean, I'm on Twitter as well. People want to follow or X, Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick. But yeah, Substack and through the Eisenhower Media Network, and I'll put a word out. I saw my colleague Bill Astori, who is a proud Massachusetts, is also a member of the Eisenhower Media Network, as is Karen Kiyotowski, who I know was your guest last month or 2 months ago. And so, if you're interested in voices like Karen's or Bill's, please check us out at Eisenhower Media Network.
We could put
Thank
all
you.
that info in our follow-up. Absolutely. Thanks again. Thanks, everybody.
Did everyone have a chance to sign that form? Do we want to put that up one more time, Mary Ellen, for anybody to be
Yeah,
involved?
it's been a few times. I will add it one last time.
That is
And
great. Please get in touch with us. We'd like to turn out a lot of people for these rallies on February 24th, fourth
one last
anniversary.
time. Here we go. And we'll also send this out in our follow-up. Okay, everyone. Good night.